You mentioned that many people were concerned with getting the Tories out. And that was a large part of what happened when campaigning. Now, we had a strategic advantage this election, we could argue. And that was that we kind of knew that the Labour Party was going to win. The Conservatives were out because they'd made such a huge mess. Now, we are, in the next 5 years, looking at new Conservative leadership, and that's looking very bleak. We're looking at the rise of reform and the Conservative Party now pandering to reform voters. We could even be looking at a potential Conservative Reform alliance or coalition of sorts. Against that will be a weakened Labour Party. Do you think it will be ethical for us to mobilise against the Labour Party in the next election? And if not, what would be the alternatives? What are our options in the face of that?
I think that's a very interesting question. I think, first of all, I think we are going to see a remarkably right-wing leader of the Tories. We're going to see dog whistle racism increasing even further. I wouldn't be surprised at all if over the next 3 to 5 years, Reform and the Tories don't just have a coalition or an alliance, but actually fold into each other, so that Reform gets folded into an even further right-wing Conservative Party. And I wouldn't be at all surprised to see Nigel Farage emerge as the leader of that entity, which I think is his plan. I think he wants to lead one of the major parties, not one of his, I don't know how many dozens of small parties he's been a part of. But the irony for me is that they present themselves as not part of the establishment, people like Farage. You know, he was a banker for 20-odd years or something, worth a fortune. Straight after the Brexit vote, which he campaigned vigorously for, he was outside the German embassy ensuring he could get his German passport because his then wife was German, so he needed the passport now that Brexit was happening, and because he knew that he was going to leave his wife. So in all ways, a truly commendable human being. And unfortunately, he's a reflection of the state of our politics. You know, Starmer, Sunak, Jenrick, Farage, I mean, all of these people, they're mediocrities. They are mendacious, and in a systemic sense, they're deeply, deeply corrupt. They have no interest in the people of this country. They have interest in power for themselves with no purpose. They don't want to achieve anything. They'll use whatever is required to get into power and to stay in power. I believe that the major parties are over. They're finished. Now, of course, electorally, they're still hugely significant. We saw one of the worst turnouts we've seen since the advent of universal suffrage in this country at the last election, because people see no reason to vote, given the state of our politics. No party offers them anything. So what do? There are some people who would like us to create a sort of a political party of the left yesterday, and think that every day we don't do that, we're losing the initiative. I personally don't think that's the way to do it. Why? Because I think that will give Starmer a way out. I think that that'll just create a target that Starmer can focus on. He can say, you don't like me? Well, you've got a choice of the sort of far-right Tory reform bunch or the far-left, Corbyn anti-Semitic bunch. Because that's how he thinks. He actually thinks a lifelong anti-racist like Jeremy Corbyn has at any point in his life been anti-Semitic, which is a complete nonsense. Of course. And, because the media is so complicit, that's the message that gets out. And it's got out into the world. We've seen that. I think we've got to, and I hope this doesn't sound too old-fashioned, but we've got to organize. We've got to organize in ways that I think the independent movement, if I can call it that, because it wasn't a coherent movement by any means, but the independent movement generated a degree of organization, a degree of energy and enthusiasm on the ground of ordinary people. On our campaign, we had people coming to us who say, I voted Tory my whole life. I can't vote for them, but I certainly can't vote for the Starmer guy, so I'm voting for you. We have to show people that politics has to change. The structures and the functioning of our politics in this country has to change fundamentally. How do we do that? We do that by organizing But of course, you have to organize towards something. And part of what you organize towards is, yes, making inroads into state power. Because if you want to change the structure and functioning of the system, you've got to get your foot in that door. At the same time, you've got to do that. So you want the state power, but you want it buoyed or foundationed or built by a mass democratic movement across this country. And how do we do that? We organize in our own communities to create the sort of structures that many of the independents are creating, be it in the Northeast, where Jamie Driscoll last weekend launched something called Majority, which is an initiative to get local communities involved and to train local communities in organizing, in how they would be electoral candidates, etc., etc. In Ilford, where Leanne Mohammed ran such a brilliant campaign. Obviously in Islington, where Jeremy's been the MP for decades and decades. But he even wants to build new structures locally in Islington, like we're doing in Camden and many other people are doing in other parts of the country. I'm aware of Southport, Preston, many other parts of the country. And I think that's incredibly exciting. So exactly. So we've got to build this grassroots politics. And while we're doing this, we've got to show people that we can make a difference on the issues that concern them day to day. So to take an example, when it comes to housing in Camden, we're going to exert pressure on the Camden Council like they have never experienced before, to change their housing policies, to make clear to them that the poorer communities of Camden are going nowhere. And if they don't want to serve them like they serve the richest residents of Camden, then they're going to have to deal with us, the vast majority of the residents of Camden. And I'm talking, and quite openly here, not just about the usual forms of pressures, of petitions, of turning up at council meetings, which they don't want to have since we've demanded they call for a ceasefire. They just close what is supposed to be their public meetings to the public they're supposed to be serving. But we'll take direct action against them too, if they are not prepared to listen to the will of the people they're supposed to represent. You know, in the local by-elections recently, the turnout was sort of between 11 and 15%. Absolutely. So, and with local government generally, I think we're missing a trick. So I think what we've got to do is we've got to build up these local structures. And in the areas where we don't have obvious people to do that, you know, Clacton, where Farage is now the MP, Northampton, where I once landed up giving a speech and couldn't believe some of the views that were coming out. We've got to organize in those communities in a way we've never done before. We've just got to go and sit and talk to people. We can't say that people who think that Starmer, Jenrick et al., because we don't know who that's going to be, Farage, are in any way a part of the solution. We've got to explain to people why that's not the case. And we've got to give them the other ways of getting things done in their communities. And when we show those people how we as citizens, as active citizens, that's what politics should be about. And then we build up from those local engagements, we build up a national movement. And that national movement decides democratically, in other words, by its membership, if and when it should become a political party. And then how that political party should function, how it should elect its leadership, what that leadership should look like, should we have a collective leadership, etc., what our policies should be. That's the way we've got to do it, because we need to do politics in this country differently. And if we just create another political party, an enormous number of people are going to say, oh, well, this is another group. You know, is this the Labour Party Mark II? Is this the people who are still disappointed about what happened in 2019, now wanting to find a place for themselves? This is just another political party. And we can't allow that.
So, Andrew, in South Africa, you saw the fall of apartheid and you saw what can happen with a drastic sort of systemic change. Now, in the UK, we're kind of facing a problem of apathy, that even though we had this amazing collective movement during the election, people have maybe become slightly disappointed with the continued stance of Starmer and Labour, and maybe people are slightly less energized and excited to engage in local politics as they are in the national politics. So bear in mind that you've seen a successful movement and you've seen the challenges that we're facing, both with the systemic corruption that is within the British system and establishment and the unyielding foreign policy that we have and the actual apartheid in Israel that they're levying on the Palestinian people. What can you say about the actual possibility of change, both domestically and even through our activism affecting foreign policy, ending the apartheid in Israel?
I'm 60 years old, and I often get described as naive and idealistic. If naive and idealistic means that I believe that our societies could be organized and function differently, then boy, I am as naive and idealistic as you can get, because I do believe those things. Why? Because I've seen it happen. I was a part of a struggle that liberated a country from over 340 years of not just racist apartheid, but an economic oligarchy as well. It was a system of government that had failed, that the West was supporting, not to the extent it's supporting Israel today, but still supporting. It had to do it covertly, because then it couldn't overtly admit it was supporting apartheid, whereas now it seems an okay thing to do, which I find astonishing. So I have a fundamental and intrinsic belief that ordinary people, like we did in South Africa, can change the course of history. An American anthropologist, Margaret Mead, at the end of her life said, "History is changed by the actions of small groups of committed, thoughtful people working together." That has always been the case, and it always will be. So how does this happen? Let's talk about Israel. Take it from people far wiser than me. My former boss, Nelson Mandela, and somebody who I was incredibly honored to call a friend and something of a mentor, Archbishop Desmond Tutu, didn't just both describe Israel as an apartheid state, and they would know. They experienced apartheid in a way that I never did in South Africa. I was a privileged white person. They said it was far worse, Israeli apartheid, than South African apartheid. Why? First of all, it was to a level of efficiency that South Africa had never gone. The checkpoints. We never had checkpoints between the Bantustans and the rest of the country. The separate roads for Palestinians and number plates. Brilliant idea. What you want to do is target each and every Palestinian simply because they're Palestinian. But most importantly, it was far and is far, far more brutal than apartheid in South Africa was. Why? Because the South African economy, the apartheid economy, was entirely dependent on what was effectively indentured black slave labor. Incredibly cheap labor, working unbelievably dangerous jobs, mainly in the mines, which was the source of wealth for the country for hundreds of years. So the apartheid regime in South Africa couldn't massacre tens of thousands of people, because these would be workers who it would then have to replace and retrain, etc., etc. So the economic logic made it less brutal. In Israel, where there isn't the same reliance on a Palestinian workforce, as we've seen, they are happy to massacre, what at minimum we know is tens of thousands of people, what might actually turn out to be hundreds of thousands of people. And our governments have watched on, not just enabling and facilitating it, but actually profiting from it, because our arms companies are making tens of billions of pounds out of the weapons that they're sending on an almost daily basis to Israel that are being used in the slaughter in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Lebanon. And how do we change that? It's very simple. BDS like we've never seen in the world before, where anybody or any institution that has any contact with the State of Israel, provides any support to the State of Israel, has to be boycotted by the vast majority of people on this planet. And we need to focus on just a few key targets. South Africa, it was Barclays Bank, which we could do again now around Israel. It was what was then called Chase Manhattan, and young people targeted them. And when they realized that they were going to lose an entire generation of customers, they said to South Africa, sorry, we can't roll over your foreign debt. It's now going to cost you significantly more. You're going to have to pay huge premiums, and we're going to withdraw from your country. And that brought the South African economy to its knees. The Israeli economy is teetering on the brink of total collapse. That's according to probably the finest economist Israel has produced, a guy called Shir Haver. The economy is teetering on the brink of collapse. If we apply extreme BDS to that economy now, Israel will have no choice but to give up apartheid and occupation. And we would then see fertile ground for the creation of a true democracy in Israel-Palestine.
But on the matter of that, I do have a few further questions. So apartheid is one way. An apartheid state is one way of describing Israel. There are other ways. A settler colony, 1, a genocidal enterprise, 2, and a US imperialist outpost. Now, Israel is sustained by consistent support from the US, military, economic, and otherwise. We are looking at an upcoming US election. Now, BDS, activism, various people's movements could get us somewhere eventually. But right now, immediately, we are looking at the possibility of the complete destruction of Gaza. We are looking at the possibility of the complete annihilation of Gaza in a way where it will no longer exist. And as far as we can see, that's been greenlit by most states. That's been greenlit by the US, by the UK, by the UN. Everyone seems to be pretty much okay with that. How do you think the US can manage, or activists in the US can manage the political landscape right now, given that the US is the principal funder of Israel? What would you say, what would you advise, possibly, is the best way to play the political landscape in the US as it lies right now, where essentially you've got 2 Zionist candidates, to try to mitigate the complete disaster that we could be looking at in 6 months to a year from now?
So first of all, just to say that your descriptions of Israel, all of which are accurate, I think, are not mutually exclusive. Mm-hmm. Israel is all of those things. South Africa was a number of those things. It was also a settler colonial state, amongst others. To answer your specific question about the US politics, just like British and European politics, is driven by a remarkably corrupt global arms trade, a trade that accounts for 40% of all corruption in all world trade. The US, which is the country involved in more conflict since the Second World War than most other countries put together, is the most militarist society we've ever seen. And Israel almost feels like an offshoot of it, and is also, obviously, unbelievably militarized. The key of this is those arms companies, because an enormous amount of that 40% of all corruption in the world goes back into our political systems in various ways, and to individual politicians. And I could give you countless examples. It's easier just to read my books, probably, or watch the Shadow World film. So what do you do in the situation at the moment of this election? Well, I think you've got 2 options. If you truly care about humanity, if you truly care about Palestine. And it's wonderful to see how many people in the US do, including a huge number of Jewish people, which I think is very, very significant for American politics, that many Jewish people are feeling very uncomfortable with US policy towards Israel at the moment. And amongst younger Jews, for the first time, they actually think that America's relationship with Israel is not in America's benefit or best interests, which is amazing. So you either say to yourself, well, on the margins, Kamala Harris will be better. You know, if you're a person concerned about reproductive rights, issues of gender and sexual identity, again, tinkering around the rule of law. You know, I think the American system is profoundly corrupt. I call it a system of legalized bribery. But Harris would probably be slightly better on sticking to what they call the rule of law than Trump is. I mean, Trump started violating the Constitution, the rule of law, the moment he stepped into the Oval Office. So you vote for Harris, even though we know she's a Zionist, even though her statements on Gaza and on Palestine have been slightly better than Biden's, which is not saying much. Exactly. She doesn't seem to have this sort of maniacal Zionist drive that Biden, for reasons I don't understand, seems to have. So you vote for her, hoping that if she got into office, she would be slightly better on the Middle East than she's been on the campaign trail. Because, the reality is with all of these politicians, they say what they think they've got to say to get elected. They don't believe a word of anything they're saying. No, they're driven purely by the pursuit of power, which is the problem with all of our politics. Or the alternative to that in the here and now is you vote for one of the anti-Zionist candidates, of whom there are two, Cornel West, two that I'm aware of, or Jill Stein from the Green Party. But you also engage in direct action. Direct action against the two main parties and against the institutions of the state of the United States of America, and particularly against America's weapons makers. So the huge, huge behemoths of Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, etc., etc. And we've seen the impact that direct action can have. Look at Palestine Action, who, are now being arrested in terms of the Terrorism Act in this country because we have an anti-democratic authoritarian prime minister who happens to be my local MP, who behaved this way when he was director of public prosecutions. He thinks that climate protesters and groups like Palestine Action are terrorists. But he can't call Israel a terrorist state because, as in his own words, he's a Zionist without qualification. So Palestine Action has seen the closing down of 3 of the Israeli arms company Elbit's factories in the United Kingdom and caused them to lose a £280 million plus contract with the Ministry of Defense. That's what Americans need to be doing to their defense companies and to their government. The point of protesting nicely, politely, the point of saying, the media is so fair and unbiased. The media is all bought by exactly the same interests that fund our politicians. So the media just parrots the nonsense that we get from our politicians rather than critically question it. So we have a responsibility to call out the state of the world as it is and to effect change through the limited tools, peaceful, I would hope, the limited tools that we have at our disposal.
On the issue of Kamala and alternatives, the landscape in American politics is slightly different to the UK, where maybe in the UK voters have a bit more power as to, I guess, the outcome or the scope of choices that you have. Now, you mentioned that Kamala doesn't seem as ideologically driven to support Israel as Joe Biden was, but she was still on the AIPAC stage, calling herself a lifetime ally of Israel, and potentially, even if not ideologically binded to Israel, she is financially binded to Israel, perhaps through funding that comes through certain lobbies. What do you think about the possibility of voting for alternative parties in the US? Do you think it is a viable option to pave a new path in the future, or do you think it could be a wasted vote?
At the moment, in an election that's going to be incredibly close, people could argue that it's a wasted vote. I'm a big fan of both Cornel West and Jill Stein, by the way, just because of the sort of policies they enunciate. And Cornel West is just such an extraordinary orator in a wonderful tradition of oratory. But at the same time, I wouldn't push anybody to vote against their conscience. I mean, if I was in the United States today and had a vote, I would be in an awful, awful bind, because on the one hand, I wouldn't want either of them in office. I don't think either of them are fit for office. I don't think either of them are fit to represent anybody but their billionaire donors and companies. That's the nature of our politics everywhere in the so-called Western world. So then how you use your vote strategically is a very, very difficult question. And part of it for me does come down to conscience and to principles and values. And in good conscience, I probably couldn't vote for her. I also, to be honest with you, I just have this sense that I'm not sure America is ready to elect a woman president. And I'm not sure that America is ready to elect a woman of color as president, notwithstanding the positives and negatives about her, which the latter outweigh the former massively. I think America and I think our politics in the Western world generally and our societies have become more racist, more misogynistic in recent years. I think the tenor of our politics has become so repulsive that it would not surprise me at all if we actually saw a victory for Trump, even though, there are very, very legitimate questions about his cognitive functioning, obviously about his ethics and his values. He is one of the most despicable individuals to run for public office in the United States, and that's saying something. I would find it very, very difficult to direct anybody because I would have such difficulty myself personally.
I mean, that's understandable. I think, at least for me personally, I always think, to vote strategically is, in certain moments, I think voting with your conscience, generally speaking, is important. But in certain instances, in certain moments, it might just do or serve us well.
I had the dilemma in South Africa where I refused to cast a vote until everybody had the vote. And people tried to persuade me that if I voted against the party of apartheid, that in itself would be a statement and would be important. I could not bring myself to do that. So, there are all of these dilemmas. I completely understand your position, and I think quite a lot of people will probably adopt that position.
In terms of foreign policy, so last night we saw missiles launched from Iran towards Israel in retaliation for a number of attacks that have occurred over the past few months, namely the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh in Iranian land, the killing of Hassan Nasrallah in Lebanon, the impending attack, the impending invasion of Lebanese territory. And that's what happened now. Israel's been going on and on about this, seemingly new strategy that they've come up with, which is escalate to de-escalate, which is a bizarre strategy which I've never heard of before. I wanted to hear your thoughts. Where do you think it's headed in the region? I hear you're writing a book on Gaza and Yemen, and I'd be interested to hear more about it and how you think this is going to play out. Are they trying to push for a regional war? And how do you think a regional war could play out?
So first of all, I think it's important to note that the United States, the West, if you will, have been trying to foment war with Iran for as long as I can remember. There was an extraordinary expose in the New Yorker quite a few years ago that showed that George W. Bush was planning a false flag operation in the Straits of Hormuz, where they had this boat that looked like one of the Revolutionary Guard boats, and they had these swarthy guys on it who they thought looked Iranian in the uniforms of the Revolutionary Guard. And the idea was that this boat was going to fire on an American vessel, and that was going to be the pretext for starting war with Iran. General Wesley Clark, who sadly believed in the Balkans you could bomb your way to peace, he did talk about the fact that when he was amongst the US's most senior military commanders, there was a list of, I can't remember, 5 or 7 countries where the US wanted regime change, and Iran was the top of that list and remains top of that list. Why? Because the US, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, America's biggest allies in the region, don't want competition for control of the region. It is obviously incredibly resource-rich, but it's also the most febrile, conflictual region of the world. And the only way it's going to become less so is through American hegemony, is the way that they see it, which I think is a nonsense. It'll become more so, if anything. It's just the nature of the conflict will change. And I'm actually going to read you something about what war with Iran would actually lead to, because this is really important. So he says, as Tony Zinni said, who was the former Central Command commander, if you liked Iraq, you'll love Iran. that is a 10 to 14 year, $3 to $4 trillion invasion, at the end of which the world, Western Asia, will look not much different than it does right now. It'll still be in turmoil, still be in chaos, and 70 million plus Iranians, 52 or 53% of cohesive Persians, will hate our living guts. That's what war with Iran will do. That's what a regional conflict will do. It will be amongst the most deadly, the most expensive, and yet another unsuccessful war for the West and its allies. And they specialize in unsuccessful wars. And why is this an issue for Israel? Netanyahu has only one get-out-of-jail card. And when I say get-out-of-jail card, I mean that literally. Netanyahu, when these conflicts end, will lose power, and if there is the tiniest vestige of the law left in Israel, he will be in jail. Not just for his crimes against humanity and his war crimes, but for his systemic ongoing corruption throughout all of his administrations, which includes countless corrupt arms deals that he's benefited personally from. And I don't say anything publicly unless I have the evidence to back it up, as my books, which all have about 3,000 footnotes, show. So as long as war continues, Netanyahu can remain in power and can even avoid calling an election. And like all of the politicians we've been talking about, his only interest is power. He doesn't care about Israel. He doesn't care about the Middle East. He doesn't care about the world. He cares about Benjamin Netanyahu, his personal power and his personal wealth. That is what politics in this world has become. And yes, he's a racist and various other things along with that. And that just feeds this. But ultimately, it's all about power. So I think that Israel will try and push the United States into a war with Iran, with Lebanon, because those are countries that they see as not under direct U.S. and allied influence at the moment. And I think that's an absolutely scary likelihood. And I think that our governments in Europe and in Britain are allowing that to happen. And if that is the route we go, we will be as much to blame as the Americans and the Israelis.
And when it comes to us, everyday people, impacting foreign policy and geopolitics and these big picture events that are shaping the world, we talked before about the need for a grassroots movement from the left, which can swing politics back and apply some pressure to a political landscape which is already succumbing to pressure from the right. So would it be fair to say that actually, in some ways, the route to changing what's going on in Israel and the genocide that's being inflicted in Gaza is actually for us to begin working on local politics? Is there a connection there?
There is an inseparability between local issues and foreign policy. So during the election in Camden, we were constantly explaining to people that we're told there is no money. That's okay. We're told there is no money for adequate affordable housing in Camden. There's no money for the highest number of Britons having to use food banks to feed their families since the Second World War. But there's an additional £4 billion for Ukraine this year. How many billions of pounds has this government spent subsidizing the arms companies who are providing the weapons to Israel? Our embassies which are marketing those weapons. Look at our defense spending. Starmer's only commitment wasn't to spending to address climate, wasn't spending to address housing, wasn't spending to address the NHS or education. It was to increase the defense budget by 9 to 10 billion pounds a year. So these things are inextricably interlinked. And we have a responsibility to point out those linkages to people and to explain to people why Gaza, why Iran, why Ukraine, why Sudan, why Yemen, are all issues for us because they are an enormous drain on our fiscal resources. Plus, they provide the corruption that is corrupting our political systems because of the corruption in the arms trade. So they're inextricably linked. And yes, what we've got to do is we've got to explain that to people on the ground, and we've got to get people to understand it, to be frustrated by it, and to effectively join a movement that demands not just, whether the Tories and the Labour exchange power every now and then, but actually to create a new type of politics. Our politics are broken. This government, with its pathetic mandate, has a huge, huge majority because of the flaws in our electoral system. We need a mixed system, a system that has some elements of a constituency system and some elements of a PR system, so that voting is actually reflected in who represents us as communities. I don't believe in pure PR, which is what South Africa has, and it's been a disaster in South Africa because it lets the party leadership have total control over its members. And if you speak out against your leadership or if you vote against them, you lose your place in parliament, which is what happened to me around corruption, because I refused to hide my own party's corruption. So a mixed system is what we need. But it's also the nature of our politics. At the moment, the assumption is that the very worst go into politics, the people who find it easiest to lie, the people who have the biggest egos. Whereas as Václav Havel, the first democratic Czech president after the so-called Velvet Revolution, he was a dissident playwright, became president by surprise. And he said, politics, because of the power that you have and the people's money that you're responsible for, should attract the most moral amongst us. Instead, because of those things, it attracts the least moral amongst us. And that's the problem with our politics, and we've got to clean up the swamp.
You mentioned that not only are these foreign policy issues or these issues affecting people around the world caused or exacerbated by the corruption that happens at home, but that these issues are actually the source of corruption at home because they are fuel for the arms machine, which is driving corruption. Could you illustrate, I know it's detailed in your books, but could you illustrate for our viewers and listeners just the extent to which the arms trade is really corrupting British politics?
So I'm going to give you the most famous case, and if people want to watch the Shadow World film, they can actually watch all about this.
Definitely watch it.
You can find it on YouTube for free at the moment, although if the producers ask, I never said that. Just watch the 94-minute version. There are various versions that people have edited themselves, but the original 94-minute version. The Al Yamamah arms deal, in which Britain sold about £43 billion of weapons to Saudi Arabia. £6 billion of bribes were paid. And that's billion with a B. Now, obviously, a lot of those bribes were paid to members of the Saudi royal family. But a whole lot of those bribes get returned to Britain in what we call the feedback principle, and they land up in the hands of corporate executives, politicians, etc., here. So, the chair of BAE Systems, the company that was most involved in the deal, was gifted by one of the intermediaries, the arms dealers involved, was gifted an apartment in Mayfair that at the time, and we're talking the 1980s, that at the time was worth £6.5 million. I mean, it's probably worth exponentially more than that now. Margaret Thatcher wouldn't allow for the contract to be signed until her son, Mark Thatcher, was given £12 million as part of those bribes. In addition to which, the main arms dealer on that transaction, who is a figure of the British establishment, ensured that hundreds, if not thousands of people were given money out of those bribes that were then donated to the Tory party. So not only was Margaret Thatcher's family benefiting to the tune of millions, but her political party was benefiting in terms of the donations that were being made to the party. And it didn't come back. It doesn't get recorded as donations from BAE Systems or even from the arms dealer, because they just use hundreds, if not thousands, of individuals who they just get given a sum of money and they're told, you will donate this to the Tory party. And they go ahead and they donate it to the Tory party. And that's how our politics works. Or you look at someone like Tony Blair, who was too young to be involved in that particular deal, who, as one of his ministers, Claire Short, said, Tony Blair was someone who never saw an arms deal he didn't like. Well, since leaving office, it's estimated that Blair has made over £110 million personally out of the decision to invade Iraq, because companies who benefited from that invasion have paid him millions of pounds a year for doing nothing in particular, which effectively bribes. They just paid after he's left office. And through his association with British arms companies, particularly BAE Systems. He and the former chair of BAE Systems, who was given this apartment in Mayfair, have done consulting work for most of the world's most autocratic, authoritarian, militarized regimes, earning millions and millions of pounds. So that's how it works. And that's why our politics is so rotten and so broken as it is now. And Keir Starmer knows that even if he only lasted as long as Liz Truss, if anyone remembers her, 640-something days?
Yeah.
Only cost us £74 billion. So, yeah. The fact that she still has the audacity to say anything, let alone appear in public, just astonishes me. She should be in jail. That's what an actual functioning society with the rule of law would result in, like they did in Iceland once. But the reality is that these interests, fed by the media, ensure that our defense budgets go up every year, that people like Keir Starmer could be in office for as long as Liz Truss, and they know they'd be multimillionaires for the rest of their lives, just because of the decisions they made during those 40-odd days, because they would be decisions that their billionaire donors and corporations have put them in that position to make. And this isn't some wayward conspiracy theory. This is just the way power works. And our mainstream media will try and label those who point this out. Oh, you conspiracy theorists, you're dumb, you're naive, you're this, you're that. And the reason for that is that mainstream media, or the commercial media as it really is funded exactly by the same people who fund our political parties and our politicians with exactly the same agenda.
On the matter of the establishment, you mentioned, so really, if we were to focus on immediate action for possible immediate impact for a very dire situation, political parties, as we've made it clear, are very rarely ideologically driven. The Conservatives and the Labour Party, neither of which have any particularly strong ideological stances or leanings. There are some politicians who have been ideologically driven in the past, but Margaret Thatcher being one of them, good or bad. But right now, that's not what we're looking at. We're looking at an establishment that wants to stay in power and benefits from staying in power, and a lobby that is effective at getting them to do what they want. Do you see a chance for us to, within the game that is presented to us, for us to become the lobby? Because the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, is right there. It's almost like a blank paper that's waiting to be filled in. You can fill it in with pretty much anything if you have the right tools. So in addition to grassroots work, building, direct action, I believe in all of those things. But in addition to that, is there an effective way for us to replace the lobby that is currently filling in those pages with something that is a little bit better, just to avoid disaster?
So what I would say to that is, first of all, it's incredibly difficult standing as an independent candidate or being a small party. So we in my campaign could spend £17,000, £17,000. The Labour Party could spend whatever it wanted. They spent more money on targeted ads just in Holborn and St Pancras than anywhere else in the rest of Britain. We obviously couldn't match that. But that's how the game is geared. It's intended to do that. So how do we create this lobby? I wouldn't call it a lobby. I would just call it accountable, transparent, democratic politics. So what I would, in the short term, say, while we're building these local structures, this grassroots movement, from the bottom up into a national movement, and one day perhaps a party that can take on these powers, don't give them your vote. Vote for one of the smaller parties. Vote for an independent. If there's no one decent standing in your area, be it locally or in a general election, Find someone from your community, like many communities across the country did, and get community support behind those, because the only way that we counter the impact of money on our politics is by doing this community-based politics, like so many independents did, who did incredibly well. Jeremy didn't have any money. Leanne didn't have any real money. We could only spend the 17,000. And it was just through the hard work, energy, and enthusiasm of ordinary people that we all actually did so well. So that has to be the basis at the moment. So, if you've got a good Green candidate, or, and this is less common, but a good Lib Dem candidate or something like that, if you're lucky enough to be in Scotland and you have a good SNP candidate who is progressive on all of these issues and wants to see money out of politics, those are the key issues. Wants to see money out of politics, wants representatives to be accountable to the people they're supposed to represent, then vote for them. If you don't, then find your own candidate. Because in every single community in the United Kingdom, there will be people who would be great representatives, who wouldn't want to do it to build a career for themselves, who wouldn't want to do it because of ego as an attempt to make further money, who would want to do it because they understand that the highest honor a community can give to someone is to give them that mandate to represent them. So that's how we do it now. But at the same time, we've got to build these local structures. And what I'll say to people is, wherever you are, if you're in Newcastle or the Northeast, look at Majority, Jamie Driscoll's initiative. Across the country, just see what initiatives are coming up. Give 2 evenings a month. And our responsibility, those of us who are building some of these initiatives, is to make it fun. To make it both fun and educational.
I believe in making everything fun. I'm here for it.
It's incredibly important. Politics doesn't have to be grim, or because all of our politicians are so grim. Doesn't mean our politics has to be grim. In South Africa, what was absolutely central to our struggle, our successful struggle, was music and culture. And we need to get that back into our politics in the United Kingdom.
I think actually that's the life of the Palestinian movement. Palestinian movement has successfully done that in, bringing to life Palestinian culture, cooking, music, poetry. It brings people together.
The Palestinian movement can teach us an enormous amount. 1. 2, I think that the impact that the Muslim vote had, which was phenomenal in Holborn and St. Pancras, and across other parts of the country as well, but I can only speak from my personal experience where it was absolutely central to what we achieved against Starmer. These are examples of the future of our politics, because we have taken goodwill. We have taken people who are prepared to sacrifice their time because they believe in what this is about and what we are doing. So I'm incredibly hopeful going forward. And I must just tell you, finally, in 1986, I had to leave South Africa at very short notice to avoid serving in the apartheid military. The night before I left my hometown of Cape Town, I was on a hill overlooking the city in tears, because I thought never in my lifetime would I be able to return to the country of my birth. In 1986, the apartheid state appeared all-powerful, getting huge support from Britain, Europe, America. Very repressive, killing people constantly. Very, very repressive. And no one could foresee that this wouldn't last as long as they wanted it to last. The reality is 4 years later, 4 years, our political prisoners were freed. All of our exiles could return home, and we started the transition to a democracy that a further 4 years later led to Nelson Mandela being elected as our first ever democratically elected president. 8 years. Now, the struggle had gone on for decades before then, obviously, but things politically can change very quickly. And the Middle East, Britain, the United States of America, and Europe are all, in my opinion, in a state of crisis now. So we should be hopeful that we have an opportunity to effect change. And as Nelson Mandela said, it's only impossible until you do it.
Wow, amazing. And on that note, we will wrap up for the day. Andrew, thank you for coming on and giving us your time. Is there anything you'd like to say to the audience? Anywhere they can find you, follow you?
Absolutely. So please support my organization's work. We're working on a book at the moment called Making a Killing, How the West Profits from the Slaughter in Yemen and Gaza. Please support us if you can. shadowworldinvestigations.org is our website. You can find me on social media. I try on Instagram, but I'm not very good at it. I am mainly on Twitter, but you can find me on either of those 2 platforms.
And make sure you subscribe to the Muslim Vote mailing list. The link is in the description to stay up to date with politics and everything you can do to get involved and create some change in the world we see around us. Assalamu alaikum and take care.
Hi.
Cool. Wicked nice one. That one.
Okay.
That was actually fun.
Sit somewhere.